Hey everyone, today we're gonna take a look at the Marvel Legends Ragnarok Deluxe action figure. A big shout out to my friend Terry who has lent me this figure for the review. Let's have a quick look at the box. Right up front we have the Thor branding logo. On the top of the box we have that hammer logo from Thor. Down to the bottom, some product information. And down to the sides, there's the artwork of Ragnarok with his eyes glowing and looking sinister. And moving on to the back is the full version of that vibrant artwork with his hammer glowing, description of the character, and some more product information at the bottom. Finally, onto that last side, it's that same artwork as well, just reflected. So let's just get this thing open right now. With the figure out of the packaging, we can see that backdrop over here. A nice symbol of that Thor's hammer in blue with lightning effects coming out of that symbol. Over here we have the figure on the plastic tray. He comes with one alternate hit, his hammer, that spinning hammer effect, and just one normal interchangeable left hand. And that means Hasbro has actually shortchanged us one cyborg gripping hand. We saw that in the initial marketing images, which means Hasbro actually can make changes from those marketing photos, but they usually don't, even with some negative fan feedback. However, over here it's clearly a cost-saving measure, and they have managed to do the fans dirty once more, so that's quite disappointing. As we go through this review, I'll be making a couple of comparisons with the original 80 Years Thor action figure because there's a lot of part reuse. First up, we're taking a look at Ragnarok's hammer. It's exactly the same sculpt that came with the 80 Years Thor, except this time the shade of grey on the plastic is different. The hammer is also given a black wash in order to bring out the text that's scripted onto the hammer. You can see that black wash is applied all over that head of the hammer. Moving on to the strap, it is also cast in a similar shade of brown. This time it's got an extra hit of grey paint at the bottom of that handle. So that grey actually matches up with the head of the hammer, so that's a nice touch. Of course, the hammer fits into his right gripping hand exactly the same way as the original 80 Years Thor figure. And similarly, he's also lacking a left gripping hand to hold his hammer in his left hand. Next up, he also has an interchangeable left hand with an open grip. There's sharp sculpting for the lines on the insides of his hands as well as the veins on the back. It's easy enough to swap out that cyborg hand for his more human-looking open gripping hand. And this open gripping hand is exactly the same sculpt that came with the 80 Years Thor. His spinning hammer accessory is for me the highlight. The main component of this accessory piece is the flat plate of plastic over here that's meant for the spinning effect. It is cast in a translucent blue plastic and it lets the light through pretty well. The handles of the hammers are also sculpted in, this time also painted with brown for the main part of the handle and grey over here at the bottom of the handle in order to match the grey of the hammer. The strap piece in the middle is inserted into the effect part, and you can actually swivel that strap piece. Onto the ends of the effect, they're actually separate pieces of grey plastic with each individual hammer head actually inserted and glued onto the backing plate. Once again, there's also black wash on that hammer head in order for the inscriptions to stand out. On the reverse side of the effect, it's similarly painted for all the hammer handles in the middle, so that's a great touch as well. Coming back to the front of this effect, I just find it really strange that all the text is visible. They should have been sculpted with a bit of motion spinning blur in order to make that effect look more realistically spinning. Because of the digital sculpting, that's probably why Hasbro hasn't modified the sculpt of the original hammer and simply just duplicated that same 3D sculpt all over this effect piece. So while the effect part looks spinning for most of it, the clearly visible text over here makes it seem as if this effect part is made of 8 hammers at the same time. The handle for the effect is sturdy enough for Ragnarok to hold it in his right gripping hand. However, that effect part is pretty heavy, and coupled with that rigid and heavy cape on the back, it can be quite a challenge to put this figure into a pose where you can balance him correctly. And the effect part definitely works well with the 80 years Thor as well, so you can have him swinging that hammer and flying into battle. However, I will say that the effect part is really heavy and I wouldn't recommend you to leave him holding that effect for an extended period of time, because I don't think that the handle is strong enough to hold its weight. In fact, you can already see that it's starting to sag over here, and you might end up with a deformed handle. And finally, he does come with an alternate head, which is exactly the same sculpt from the 80 years anniversary Thor. There's very subtle difference in the skin tone as well as the color of the hair. The wings on the sides of its helmet are now cast in a yellowish white plastic compared to the more silver white on the 80 years Thor. That helmet piece is still cast in a silver metal looking plastic, and there's also similarly a light yellow sort of dry brush effect on that hair in order to bring out the sculpting. The paintwork is also of course different on his face. This time Hasbro has used the digital dot matrix printing technique for red in the eyes, as well as very sharply applied paint for his eyebrows as well as his lips. There's very subtle faint dotting on his cheeks. I suppose that adds a little bit of shading, but it's also kind of unnecessary. And of course, with the digital printing technique, the facial features look a lot sharper compared to the 80 years Thor. And of course, the neutral alternate head also pops on just fine onto the body. So Ragnarok comes with more accessories than the 80 years Thor. However, the 80 years Thor does come with an extra accessory, which is an interchangeable left fist. And because they are the same sculpt, that left fist of course also fits onto Ragnarok, with a very minor difference in the skin tone. Looking at the sculpt of the figure itself, and everything is reused. The only new parts are of course the head sculpt as well as that left cyborg hand. Besides the spinning hammer effect, the next best thing about this action figure is of course the head sculpt. Because of the exposed cyborg head, the head sculpt looks at once sinister on the right side with the skin, and ragey on the left side. The dot matrix painting technique is really sharply applied with red for his eyes and a little bit of overspray for that red paint in order to make it look like the eyes are glowing. The paint for his eyebrows as well as his lips are also similarly sharply applied. There's also white for the teeth on the cyborg side of the head, really bringing out those Terminator vibes. The great thing about this head sculpt is that the wings as well as the hair are actually different from the other head sculpt. The wings are now bigger and have a fuller sculpt. The hair has also that similar light yellow dry brush, so that really brings out the textures as well. The dry brush seems to be applied more generously on his default head sculpt. Moving on to his torso, it is also similarly cast in that black plastic. Likewise, sharp sculpting so you can see the texture of that leather looking vest that he's wearing, those high and sharp shoulder pads, as well as silver for the circles on his torso. The silver paint now on Ragnarok seems to be just ever so slightly darker. There's still gold for his belt buckle, and the belt is now painted a light shade of brown as compared to the mustard shade on the 80 years Thor. The skin tone on the Ragnarok figure is also slightly different, but the sharp details of the sculpting is still retained with all those veins and muscle contouring. The red plastic for his wristbands are now a brighter shade of red, and the same goes for his cape as well. The wristband still has a hit of black paint down the middle. And looking at his cyborg hand, it's really nicely sculpted, skeletal detail on the outside as well as a couple of round plates for his knuckles. The skeletal detail is also brought onto his fingers, and all that detail is really brought out because of that black paint wash. So the black wash is really nice to bring out the mechanical details in his hand. However, that paint wash is noticeably absent on the cyborg side of his face. So the metal on his cyborg head sculpt looks mismatched compared to his mechanical hand. We come round to the back of the figures, and this is where the brighter shade of red for the cape is more obvious as well. The cape is similarly given a black wash, however that black wash seems to be more heavily applied on the 80 years Thor. And flipping the capes up, you can see that the paint for the belt also goes all the way around his waist. The rest of his lower body also has that same paint treatment compared to the 80 years Thor. The hip joints are cast in the black plastic and given that blue paint in order to match the rest of his pants and the blue plastic on his thighs. The boots are also now that light brown to match that paint on his belt. There's black paint for the tops of those knee-high boots. However, the rest of his calf as well as his foot looks so much more plain because of the lack of the black paint in between those straps that you can see on the 80-year store. And it's also missing the paint for the buckles on top of his shoe. So in this respect, the Ragnarok lower body actually looks a lot more boring compared to the 80-year store. For articulation, his head is on a ball hinge. However, because of the hard sculpt of his hair interfering with both his torso as well as his hard cape, you can barely get much rotation out of that head. He's able to look back just that bit, and he can look down a little bit as well. Swivel hinge at the shoulders so you can get his arm to spin all the way around as well as come out really far. Swivel at the bicep for 360. Double joint at the elbows, going just past 90 degrees, which is decent for a big muscle guy. Swivel hinge at the wrist that spins 360 and articulates in as well as out. Because he's got a hammer wielding right hand, the hinge on his right hand allows for up as well as down articulation. He's got a ball joint in the middle of his torso, so that gets you quite a generous bit of sideways tilt. The peg in the mid-torso ball joint does feel a little gummy, so you might think that you get a lot of forward bend, but the range is actually pretty limited. And the same goes for that backward bend as well. He's also got a swivel at the middle of his waist, so that lets you spin him 360. Ball joints at the hips for pretty decent range outwards on the sideways, and they also work just fine forward and backward. There's a thigh swivel for 360 spin. Double jointed knees for very good range. There's a calf swivel, and that's quite well disguised by that strap design on his boots. And finally, there's also ankle tilt upwards as well as downwards, and ankle pivot outwards as well as inwards. The articulation is Marvel Legends standard, but the limited range in his torso as well as his neck does make some poses look a little awkward, and coupled with the heavy and rigid cape as well as the really heavy spinning hammer accessory, it really is quite a challenge to get him balanced in a more dynamic pose. Ragnarok stands at just under 7¼ inches, and that's about 18 centimeters. Naturally, he towers over Captain America and Iron Man. He's also much bigger than Doctor Strange, but dwarfed by the Hulk. Here he is with Enchantress and Malekith, with the old Hasbro Loki and the tiny Toy Biz Destroyer. Here he is with some G.I. Joe Classified series, and some Star Wars Black series. This figure was never meant to be an updated Thor figure. Despite the spinning hammer accessory and cool cyborg head sculpt, I cannot recommend this, especially with the increased price point, the omitted cyborg gripping hand from the prototype, and the lazy reuse of everything else. If this goes to clearance, it might only be worth getting just for the spinning hammer. Please like and share this video, let me know what you think in the comments below, and subscribe to my channel for more toy reviews. Thanks for watching, take care and stay safe.